Thank you for that. So, yeah, I work at Teesside University, but I'm really lucky to work with Professor Aisha Holloway all the time, actually. So we work on various projects together. She supervised my PhD, and I'm helping her, well, loosely helping organise the Anibra conference that you mentioned before. So, which, by the way, is great. I've presented at that a few times. I've actually presented what I'm going to talk about today. And so just before I kind of explain what this research is, I feel like I'm a little bit of an odd bod, I guess, in that I am a public health researcher, but I'm also a criminologist. It's took me a long time to be able to say that because I've not really been sure where I fit for a long time. But I do a lot of public health research in the criminal justice system. So myself and Aisha and various others have done multiple projects with men in prison, and we're working on the Appraise project at the moment, which looks at Edinburgh Prison and Durham Prison. And it was kind of really because of that I ended up doing this research that I'm going to talk about. So this is something that came from my PhD, which luckily is done and dusted, but we have moved on a little bit, so I'll give you some more information as we go through. So basically what I wanted to do was look at, she says, as she can't share the screen, was look at how feasible it is to deliver alcohol screening and brief intervention to women in prison. And to give you a bit of an overview of why I wanted to do that, like I say, I was working with Aisha in the male estate, and we established pretty quickly from a pilot study that it was feasible to do this, to do alcohol screening and brief intervention with men in prison. And I was kind of responsible for collecting a lot of the data in that. And when I say that, I spoke to around about 500 men in prison. And every time I had a conversation with them, so we did structured interviews and qualitative interviews, semi-structured, I was thinking, as a woman, I'm not sure this would kind of work. I'm not sure these responses would come from women. So I did a bit of research, and I guess this is what I'm going to talk you through before I show you my project. And basically, to be a woman in prison is very different to being a man in prison, go figure. And my research looked at women in an open prison, which made it even more different because the distance between a woman's home and the prison is around about, I think the average is about 100 miles. It's really important to establish they only make up 5% of our prison population. So it makes sense that interventions have been tailored towards men because it's more cost effective. There's 3,500-ish women in prison. So it's a lot of money to spend on such a small population, but hopefully I can show you why it's worth it. We know that around about 24% of females who go into prison are risky drinkers. So this is higher than men. So there's a need, good. So there's a rationale to go and do this work. They suffer different inequalities to men, and there's something I'm going to talk you through called the gendered pains of imprisonment, which is where my kind of criminological hat comes on, I guess. They are more likely to suffer many different experiences as a child, abuse being one of them, so nearly twice as likely. So that's going to have an effect on how we get them to engage in a alcohol brief intervention and why perhaps they might need them tailored differently, and twice as likely to have attempted suicide. The figures on self-harm are also astronomical and really quite upsetting. And the reason I kind of am explaining this is because we'd established that it was feasible to do brief interventions in this busy prison environment. But what I was getting a sense of was this was going to need to be a much more holistic intervention. So the brief intervention itself probably wouldn't be that different. That was my loose hypothesis, I guess. But what we did alongside it was going to have to be very different because of all of these issues. So I'm not going to bore you to death with my PhD, but I did quite a lot. I did 2 different systematic reviews to try and tie the criminology to the public health. So one of them looked at the barriers and facilitators to brief alcohol interventions for women just in general, to see, is there anything that actually is just relatable to prison as well, as to why they may or may not engage. So things like stigma, I guess, is still relevant. I also looked at the gendered pains of imprisonment because it's not very widely researched in terms of, well, it's definitely not in terms of alcohol, but there are very small studies all over the world, but not huge studies apart from kind of Crewe down in London. Then I did a lot of qualitative work that I'm going to talk you through today, and how and why I took the work forward. So the qualitative work involved interviews with women in an open prison and relevant staff and stakeholders. So that was staff within the prison, but also various public health commissioners, that kind of thing. Anybody who had a role to play in if we wanted to move this work forward and deliver these interventions. If qualitative thematic analysis can ever be beautiful, this really was, and it's not because it was my PhD and I'm that kind of sad. It really was beautiful in that it was very chronological, and that wasn't what I had set out to do, and it certainly wasn't what I thought I would get. But because I didn't go in and say, talk me through your life, I went in and showed them a piece of paper and said, if I was delivering this intervention to you, we would talk about A, B, C, and D. What do you think? So I didn't think I would get this beautiful data that I got. So they were split into kind of 5 themes. So the women's journey into prison, through the prison, how she makes her decisions while she's in the prison, what happens when she leaves the prison. So this journey out of the prison, which becomes really important when you're looking at implementation and how you follow these women up, that kind of thing, when you're looking at trials in prison. And then this more pragmatic theme of how would we actually deliver them? Who do they want to do it? When should it be done? And if I'm being completely honest, that's all I thought I would get from this research. I thought they would say, have it be this person, do it on this day. And I thought they would be very quite closed in what they told me. And that's why I was saying it was quite beautiful. So they were about an hour-long interviews, and I showed them a mock-up of the intervention, and that's where this links to the work that we are doing in the male estate, because we've got an intervention there, so that it was based on that. So I'm not going to go into loads and loads of detail. I don't even know where I'm at for time, so just stop me if I'm going on. But just to give you an idea of what were they talking about when they were talking about their journey into prison? Well, unsurprisingly, given the background slide that I gave you before, they talked a lot about their chaotic lifestyles. This was drugs, alcohol, abuse, poor relationships. And what's really important is these themes came from the women themselves, but also the staff. The staff were seeing the same things in these women's journeys as the women were seeing in themselves, which leads to kind of a lot of information about staff rapport and how open and honest they are with the staff, which is good if you're trying to deliver an intervention. So some examples of what they were saying. There was a woman who said, I really wasn't bothered about coming to prison. At the time, it was a relief. I think that's what it says. I can't see the end of the slide. And another woman talking about, she could make the link between her alcohol use and how she'd ended up in prison. She knew she drank too much. She knew she would end up in a fight, and she knew she'd end up back being arrested. And she'd been in and out of the criminal justice system for a long time. So what was interesting was that juxtaposition between the women who just didn't care and the women who could make that link. Now, that's going to be important when you're trying to get them to engage in an intervention. So it makes it more complicated because we're dealing with different types of women, but we need to establish this before we try and just go in and do interventions. When they were talking about their journey through, the prison, it was really quite prominent that I explained that this was an open prison. It's very different to a closed prison. They are allowed to go home for periods of time, which then means the temptations to drink are there. They have to pass the pub, for example, the minute they walk out of the prison. But they're not allowed to drink. So it's a good place to do an intervention because they're really being tested, as opposed to the males that we work with who don't have access to alcohol. Although I'm not naive, we know what goes on. So when they talked about this difference between the two estates, that was quite important because I wanted to establish, should I be doing this in the open estate, or do they have a better or a different rapport with the staff in the closed estate? And actually that's where it should be. The overwhelming sense was no, it needs to be in the open estate because they did have a different relationship. But we have to acknowledge that they don't just walk through the doors in the open estate and think, hallelujah, I've got a bit of freedom. It's really overwhelming. And that becomes important when we look at, well, when do we give them this intervention? And it was very clear it should not be straight away. So it took some time getting used to normal life, they called it. Now, as someone who was going into the prison, there's nothing normal about it, but to them, compared to what they've been living in, it really, really is. And really important, they said, well, you're asked if you want to take part, and if you don't, nobody else contacts you or asks you anything else. So that gave me an idea of, well, hang on, we need to offer this to everybody, but we need, instead of just, do you want to do it, and then not being involved again, we needed some more thought around that. What I wanted to get a sense of was why or why not would they engage with this intervention? So how do they make their decisions? Unsurprisingly, a lot of the women, it was to do with their family. So, they were saying, well, I would never jeopardize anything to be at home with my family, so I wouldn't drink. So there was an element of build that into the intervention, reinforce why they would want to maybe engage with this. This quote here of it's like they take a different tablet here I don't think I'll ever forget that, because they were talking about the staff, and that was simply because they called them by their names, they let them make their own phone calls, they let them do the laundry. So a lot of the women were saying, yeah, I would be more than happy for a staff member to deliver this intervention, whereas that's the absolute polar opposite of what we get with the males, because they have a different relationship. When they were looking ahead, they were talking about, the logistical difficulties. Where am I going to live? Do I have to go to a hostel? Am I going back to certain friends, family? But there was this lovely shift in identity in the women saying, it's my final journey. A lot of the women were grateful, which was lovely and good to hear, but really quite upsetting. So women saying things like, glad I went to prison, I would never have changed. As a criminologist, that's what I want to hear, but it's hard when that woman sat in front of you. But it also suggests a good time to be doing this intervention. So luckily, I found that it was feasible and it was very acceptable, which meant I could make some recommendations for a future trial. And I did that as part of my PhD. And also when I was writing it up, I was lucky enough to put in a bid. So we do have an NIHR bid in at the moment through the second round. That basically uses a combination of the findings from this research and the findings that we've got in the appraised study with the men. And what we want to do is similar to appraise. We want to give them the intervention in the prison based on tailoring it in this way. But we want to use probation officers who are based in women's prisons in the hope that we can kind of join up some dots for when they come out of the prison. And we will be looking at using all of the prisons, the women's prisons. I mean, I say all, there's about 12. Very quickly, it did highlight the importance of using the 10-question audit. That was really important in establishing rapport with the women. And I know I didn't go into detail about that. And the most unexpected finding was that every single one of them suggested it should be delivered by a uniformed officer, which if I had have made a hypothesis, that would never have been in it.